You're listening to episode 128 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. In this two-part episode, we speak first with Shelley Johns and Kathy Beck-Coon, and then co-author Anne Cottingham, about their work on how mindfulness can help those with cancer and their family caregivers. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made available from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going, and if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. Mindfulness practice has been shown in research to potentially influence the quality of people's lives. Of course, one's actual experience may vary, and taking on a meditation practice should be appropriately timed and with the guidance of a qualified teacher. And with those conditions in place, mindfulness can help people through some of the most challenging stages of their lives, including advanced cancer. That shift isn't limited to patients either, as their families, those who love and care for them, can also grow their capacity to work with these difficult and otherwise often overwhelming times. Dr. Shelley Johns is a board-certified clinical health psychologist and Regenstrief Institute research scientist. Her patient-oriented research primarily focuses on testing integrative mind-body interventions to reduce cancer-related fatigue and associated symptoms for post-treatment cancer survivors and improving adaptive coping and quality of life for adults with advanced-stage cancer and their family caregivers. Dr. Kathleen Beck-Coon is a board-certified physician, long interested in integrative health and well-being. Her journey into teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction has grown from the practice of meditation as a source of healing in her own life. Meditation practice since 1979, insight mindfulness practice since 1992, regular silent teacher-led retreats of 5 to 28 days since 2004, and through continued learning as a certified MBSR teacher and MBSR teacher trainer. Anne Cottingham is Director of Research in Health Professions, Education, and Practice with the Regenstrief Institute and Indiana University School of Medicine, where she co-directs the ASPIRE program. She is a health services researcher with focus on spiritual, religious, and psychological dimensions of illness and care, the role of community organizations in enhancing health, and healthcare team communication. Our guests today are Shelley A. Johns. Shelley, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ted. Thank you for having us.
And Kathleen Beck-Coon. Kathy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ted. It's great to be here.
So before we get started with the topic for our conversation today, I just want to ask a little bit about each of your backgrounds. And maybe, Shelley, we could start with you.
Okay. So, Ted, I work as a board-certified clinical health psychologist at the Indiana University School of Medicine. And I have been working in cancer care. I've been honored to work in cancer care for more than 20 years. And so everything that we'll be talking about today draws directly out of my work and some of the struggles that I have seen folks have throughout the duration of my career so far. And that's where the idea, or my portion of the idea for this study came from. So we can talk more about that.
Thank you. Kathy, how about you?
I'm a physician, practiced in OBGYN for many years, and then transitioned into teaching and research based in mindfulness. When Shelley mentioned struggle, what comes up for me is mindfulness has been such a support for me in challenging times of life, and not just a support, but a lifeline, literally. So really happy to be in this work with Shelley.
Thank you very much. Well, let's talk about this particular topic we're in for today. And just so folks who are listening to this episode understand, we also have as a second half of this same episode, a conversation with Ann Cottingham, who is also involved with this. So we'll get to that later on. For a moment, let's talk about this was not just one pilot, but two. So I'm wondering if you could describe how this got started. Did the first pilot lead to the second, and what was that all about?
So yes, the second pilot definitely drew out of the first. And I'll definitely be interested in hearing, having Kathy contribute to the response to this one as well. When we conducted the first pilot a few years ago, neither Kathy nor I knew for certain what the effects would be. That's why you do research, right? And so lots of our colleagues in town had mentioned, especially to me, that they didn't think that it was going to be feasible to get adults with cancer and their beloved family members in the room for a 6-week intervention that was based on mindfulness. Well, Kathy and I were quite certain that we could, invite people and that they would come to what we were offering. But we needed to conduct the first pilot, which was based on assessing the feasibility of what we were offering. And we were stunned at the positive results that we got, that patients reported in that first pilot. But as you know, Ted, when you're conducting scientific investigation, you need to compare it to something. And so Kathy had developed this intervention that we tested based on mindfulness for both the patient and the person with cancer and their family caregiver. And we were just so pleased with the results that they were reporting that we decided to conduct the second pilot to compare the intervention that Kathy had developed to usual care so that we could see, do the results, are the results still as strong even when you compare it? Because since we didn't have a comparator in the first pilot. So that's why we are talking today about two different pilots because they were clearly based on each other. And then Kathy can talk a little bit more about the intervention that we developed, that we tested.
And really in that feasibility, there was a lot of affirmation, in having these mindfulness practices. And they were 15 to 20 minutes long. But 83% of these folks practiced, and on an average of 5 days a week. So no small thing. And they really were interested in continuing their practice at the end of the 6 weeks. The classes were 2 hours long, and even people who came in wheelchairs didn't feel like that was too long. So absolutely feasible.
It's so interesting to hear that people have that high a rate of dedication in this program and the feasibility when there is so much else going on in their lives during treatment with their families and all the rest of it. Was that something that was surprising to you, or was it more of a confirmation for you of what you might have expected with a program like this?
It really wasn't surprising in that I would imagine most of us recognize when talking to people who have come right up face to face with their mortality in this way, there's a real recognition, even if it's not voiced, that life is very precious and I want to be with it as much as is possible. I don't want to miss anything. But what often gets in the way is that at the same time wanting to avoid the unpleasant and trying to clutch at some base of security when there isn't one, not only intrapersonally, but interpersonally. And so those two things were a really rich place to explore mindfulness, being present in a lot of kindness, a lot of compassion.
And although I wasn't surprised that that the results were as positive as they were, I think I was a little bit surprised by the magnitude of the improvements that folks were reporting. Because again, every person with cancer in this study had advanced stage disease. And their oncologist had said this was part of the eligibility requirement for both pilots, is that the oncologist had to say that they would not be surprised if that particular patient died in the next 12 months. And so these are folks who are dealing with a lot of medical challenges and a lot of symptoms, and almost all of them are on treatment and, just very rigorous treatments. And so I think I was just surprised by the magnitude. I was surprised by the amazing attendance rates that we had. Usually the only time people missed was when they were hospitalized. I think I was just a little surprised by the magnitude. The other thing that was just so incredibly touching to me was just the gratitude that all of these participants, whether it was the patient or the family caregiver, that they expressed to us every step of the way. And many of them even continued to keep in touch with us after the study ended. And just so many people felt like it was life-changing for them. And I just was so touched by that. And that's what motivated me to want to write, the grant for the next pilot, to make sure that this work could continue so that we could support as many patients and family members as possible.
And that brings to mind another piece of the connection between the two pilots, which is, as with mindfulness, it's initiated by courage, not the courage of fighting, but the courage of being present with an open heart. And the second study had a control group. So it takes courage to even show up for these classes. So it wasn't just courageous people, especially in the, when we looked at those with a control group, everybody had courage to show up. And yet mindfulness, definitely made a difference. Cultivating that practice intrapersonally and then in a dialogic way.
I'm wondering if you might say a little bit more about the structure of the intervention, because this was not just the folks who were undergoing treatments for advanced cancer, but also their family members, which is it's a different demographic, because what they're encountering is very different from the person who is in treatment. So can you say a little bit about the intervention itself and its structure?
As you said, we included caregivers. They were primarily partners. There were some patient-child dyads, and in one case, a dear friend. Although they're different dynamics, it's also recognizing that common humanity that, everybody in this situation is living with cancer. Even if the cancer's not in both people's bodies, everybody's living with it. And those are rocky seas. And in addressing that commonality, there's less duality, I guess, in the fact that we're suffering, because whenever we're suffering, we have that natural tendency to want to get out of it. So there are, different circumstances coming in, but that's true in any mindfulness class, really. There are lots of different types of suffering. And at some point in practice, in at least group mindfulness-based, interventions, everybody starts to recognize, wow, there's a lot of common factors here.
And that's, in fact, one of the key features of these group kinds of programs and interventions, is that there is a heterozygous group, that there is a wide variety of ways in which people may be encountering their suffering and what they have in their lives. And that's an advantage to having that group dynamic.
Yeah, it's a lot less isolating because the natural tendency, I think, of most people when they come in the room is my situation is really unique and you can't understand that. And therefore, I feel alone. And part of this, the communication piece, the mindful dialogue piece within this intervention was that recognizing that self-compassion and compassion are not different. And that in that we can be with our own suffering, recognize someone else's suffering, and literally the communing part of communication, literally be with this together without knowing where it's going, unclutching from, I want it to be a particular way.
So we'll be speaking later on in this episode with Anne about the qualitative results from the proof of concept pilot. But I'd like to hear from each of you about what you observed about the unfolding in each of the pilots. What were some of the things that stood out for you that may have been surprising or gratifying or confusing or whatever might be something that would be interesting to share?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that one of the other eligibility criteria that we had for this study was that the patient had to show some signs of avoidant coping, which, as you know, Ted, is very common. I'm certainly no stranger to avoidant coping myself. We wanted to make sure that we were, truly offering this intervention to the folks who could benefit the most. And so, as you might know, the literature would suggest that about 50% of adults with cancer who ultimately die of their cancer do so without having had a timely end of life conversation with their oncologist and oftentimes with their family members. And so that leaves, patients and their family members and the physician in a very troubling situation where, oftentimes we don't know as death draws near what treatments the patient would have wanted when they were still able to speak for themselves. And so one of the key things that we built into the intervention was making sure that we offered, tools and guidance on how to be able to broach those conversations in a timely fashion. And so what I was gratified with is that we also showed in that first pilot that the folks with cancer had made significant progress on having conversations with their oncologist, conversations that they had previously avoided about their goals of care. And then also more, patients were also making good progress on signing, some of their advance directives where they could really make their wishes known and let their core values be known to their family member as well as to their healthcare team. And so I think that was one of the other gratifying features is that folks who had been avoiding doing so, which is completely understandable because these are tender, sensitive conversations to have. But we found that they had made substantial progress on their advanced care planning. And so I just was really thrilled about that.
Kathy, how about for you? Was there anything that stood out for you as an interesting, maybe progression, perhaps that connection piece you were talking about before? That sounded interesting to me, at least.
Yes, the understanding that these tender conversations don't dash hopes, but rather support connection, support joy in that counterintuitive way that mindfulness, turning towards the difficult does. Seeing that experience unfold experientially, not because folks were told that was the case, but seeing it in their own experience was very gratifying. And I found it quite interesting, as Shelley said, and even more than 50% of the people that came into these studies had not spoken to their oncologist. I was surprised, maybe particularly as a physician, to hear that even though one of the criteria were that the oncologist wouldn't be surprised if, the patients would die in the intervening year. I would say almost to a person, they had not been told that by their oncologist. And so this coping mechanism that we all have to a certain degree of wishing things were different or thinking things are different or they aren't going to change, was actually enhanced by the lack of communication with the physician. And so very gratified to see that these conversations could open, but I was likewise surprised at the level of anger present that they hadn't previously known about palliative care, that they previously hadn't known about what is now present in many states, including Indiana, where we are, of physician actionable orders to support and empower what people want in this time of life we call the end of life.
Yeah, there's an interesting balance and space with treatment to help promote healing, and also to note that there's a point at which more information is needed around what are the full spectrum of options and possibilities that are occurring in one's care, whatever that may be. And as you've both articulated so beautifully, there is an avoidance. Certainly I had that myself. I've seen that in others going through difficult times, whatever they may be. And that, Kathy, as you said, that against the stream way that mindfulness practice turns towards that which may be unwanted or unpleasant can be quite empowering, in that it opens doors about what the possibilities may be, even those that are not the wanted ones. And knowing that itself can bring some solace during difficult times.
It also opens the doors to joy and possibility of connection. The intimacy of this dance of being present and not knowing what's next, no matter what the valence is, pleasant or unpleasant, was a surprise to many people. And, I mentioned anger, but really the biggest part of this was the gratitude and the joy that was recognized in connection. People often said, especially people who are partnered, I don't remember being this close since we fell in love.
It's just the intimacy of that really emerged. And there was just something about the practice of mindfulness that really allowed people to connect with that concept and with that just part of their relationship that maybe had gotten covered up by the cancer.
By the fear, by the avoidance due to fear and not knowing what to do with grief.
We're trying to, we just also heard in the qualitative interviews that both partners had been so trying to protect the other, but in that kind of desire to protect, and it's a way of turning away from each other and then struggling and suffering alone. And so somehow the practice was, really helped facilitate, setting down some of that social constraint that had been happening for great purpose. I mean, I think it was all well-intentioned, but I feel like it had helped to kind of shatter some of that social constraint that had been getting in the way of the intimacy and the connection and the walking through this together.
You talked about the two groups coming into this. Sharing in the practice also identified a shared intentionality to be present, and that capacity to verbalize that, which then enhanced not only, I can tap into the wisdom of my own body, heart, mind, and by George, so can this person in front of me. So trusting that capacity for wisdom, for compassion, is what allowed that field of connection.
So having been through a couple of these pilots and your own work, each of you over the years in this, I'm wondering about what some things you would like to see either coming directly out of these pilots or perhaps other work. What would you like to see happen or perhaps change with palliative care, or for those who are undergoing advanced cancer treatment and their caregivers?
Well, I think one of the things that that I would like to see happen, but based on these two pilots, that our next step for the research is to conduct a fully powered efficacy trial of this intervention, that Kathy has developed, so that we can truly see the magnitude of the effect. Because if it's proven to be efficacious, then what we would like to be able to do is to disseminate these results and to have this implemented in cancer centers around the country, so that the families that are interested in deepening their ability to turn toward the unwanted and to cope more effectively perhaps with what is here, we want them to be able to have access to this. Because right now, I just don't know that mindfulness practices are being widely, implemented in cancer centers for folks with advanced stage cancer. And we've shown in our pilots that it can be very beneficial. So that's what I would hope, is that it could become more widely available. And then particularly with regard to folks who are having a difficult time completing their advanced care planning process, because these practices can be very, very supportive in helping people to feel able to have the conversations that they need to have. So that would be my thought on that.
Thank you. To have studies that will support mindfulness practices as part of integrative care is a heartfelt wish of mine, certainly. We didn't go into this with some sort of conceptual endpoint in mind, which is part of mindfulness. So there was no promotion of, it will be better if you decide this, but rather that real empowerment of, you have the capacity to know what you want, and it starts with your capacity to be present to yourself in your own body, in your own mind. And for caregivers, professional caregivers, family caregivers, patients themselves, to be able to tap into this, that's my heartfelt wish.
Is there anything else either of you would like to share with the listeners about your experiences in these programs?
I'd like to share gratitude for all my teachers, my mindfulness teachers in all traditions, and maybe a particular gratitude for how this practice has been articulated in relationship through the teachings of Gregory Kramer, Florence Malio-Meyer, Phyllis Hicks, in interpersonal mindfulness. The guidelines for that of being able to pause and be in our bodies and acknowledge what's here, allow it with a lot of kindness, and open to not knowing what's next, to really trusting that, so that we can speak truthfully, listen deeply, listen mindfully. I'm really grateful for all my teachers.
And I also want to make sure that we express gratitude to the funders of this work, the Walther Cancer Foundation, as well as Indiana University Health. They have funded each of the pilots, and so we could not have done this work, and we could not have offered what we offered to these precious patients and their family members if it weren't for that funding. And then mostly, I know Kathy and I both want to thank each and every one of the, 13, so 68 dyads, 68 patients and their family caregivers. So we touched 136 lives in both of these pilots, and we could not have done this work without them. We learned so much from each of them. So I want to, Kathy thanked, the teachers, and I also want to thank each and every one of those precious individuals, because they were my greatest teacher.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, our guest today, Shelley A. Johns. Shelley, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
And Kathleen Beck-Coon. Kathy, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ted. A real joy to share together on this.
Yes.
And for those of you who are listening, please don't go away. We're going to now start our second half of today's interview. Our guest today is Ann Cottingham. Ann, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we've been speaking with your colleagues, Shelley and Kathy, about the structure of the trial in this episode, and we'll come to that in a little bit in the results. But I wanted to start by asking you about your background. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I have degrees in ethics and in theology. I have worked for several years with undergraduate medical education at the IU School of Medicine, and specifically focused on our competency curriculum in the areas of communication and ethics and professionalism. I became interested in research through much of the work that we had done around professionalism, and began working with the Regan Street Institute about 4 years ago. I have done research in many areas related to cancer, related to patient and physician communication, and related to the ability to integrate patient spiritual and religious values into their care. So that's my background.
Great, thank you. And how did you get involved with the model care program?
Yes, so I do qualitative research. And I was talking with Shelley about the work that she has been doing in mindfulness, specifically the work around the model care study. And she invited me to join her in reviewing the data that was generated through the qualitative interviews, and also the qualitative responses in the surveys that were distributed to the participants after the intervention.
Great. So we've talked with your colleagues about that, and maybe you can speak to the results. What was reported back?
Sure. So one of the pieces of this intervention that was particularly interesting was trying to understand better whether or how mindfulness technique could potentially improve the ability of cancer patients to think about advanced care planning. Because that is a topic that we know is really important for patients with cancer, to have an opportunity to think about what their values are in terms of how they want their end of their lives to look, as well as the kind of care and treatment they might want to receive at the end of their lives. Unfortunately, while this has been an ongoing effort in terms of trying to enhance or increase the amount of advanced care planning that patients with cancer actually conduct and implement, it's something that has not become very frequent. And so we know through recent studies that maybe half of patients who have cancer have actually talked with their oncologists about their wants and needs, and fewer than that have oncologists who can remember what those might be. So we thought that one potential roadblock in terms of completing advanced care planning could be the psychological issues that patients and their caregivers both might experience along with cancer. There's often a fear of thinking about the future, because that involves thinking about death and involves thinking about the potential oncoming negative physical consequences of cancer. And that fear can inhibit patients as well as their caregivers from doing that important advanced care planning work. It can also inhibit them from even talking with their oncologists about their prognosis and about what to expect next, and advanced care planning with their oncologist. So the study, as you know through your talk with Shelley, implemented a mindfulness intervention with the patients to try to address some of these concerns and see whether the mindfulness could enhance the ability of patients to think about these topics without fear or without the emotional reactivity that they might otherwise have. In following the intervention, the patients each and their caregivers participated in an interview where they shared their responses to what they had gotten out of the intervention. They also wrote open text responses in a survey describing from their perspective what they had gotten out of that intervention. And so through our analysis of those, we identified 4 really interesting themes. First, both patients and caregivers reported that they had enhanced ability to cope with many of the stresses that cancer causes. They said specifically the practices that they had learned through the mindfulness intervention around loving kindness and around the body scan that allowed them to kind of accept and think about in a kind and compassionate way their current situation. That those practices enabled them to be more comfortable with where they were in their lives right now, to better accept their new identity as a patient with cancer, and an identity that evolves as the physical symptoms and challenges of cancer evolve over time. They were better able to be calm in addressing both physical challenges of treatment, but then in also thinking about with their caregivers and oncologists what the future might bring. And so they reported that the study did allow them to think, I think, in a different way about the future and in a way that might allow them to be more open to advanced care planning. The study also showed that the patients and caregivers reported that these mindfulness practices allowed them to lower their emotional reactivity. All of them described strong emotions related to cancer, including fear and anxiety and a general sense of trauma in dealing with this disease. But they also reported that the mindfulness practices like pausing, taking a breath, were very useful in responding intentionally when these kinds of emotions arose, rather than just kind of automatically to this kind of stimuli. Patients, for example, noted that they were able to think about how can I better deal with a negative circumstance when one came up. Several mentioned being able to speak with their oncologist about their emotions in a way that they had not previously. Caregivers also noticed that the mindfulness practices help them to respond in a thoughtful way rather than in an impulsive way when they experience negative emotions in response to their cancer. And so we were very interested to see that the mindfulness practices also helped patients and caregivers in this area of emotional reactivity as well. Two final themes. The mindfulness intervention, as you heard, included both traditional mindfulness practices, but also a mindful dialogue component. And so part of the program worked to help patients and caregivers communicate with each other in a mindful way. Again, lowering emotional reactivity and opening themselves up to discuss issues that are emotionally laden with greater acceptance and greater compassion. And we found that both caregivers and patients reported that through this program, they did develop stronger relationships with each other in many cases, noting that they felt closer to each other, they felt a stronger connection with each other, and that they were able to listen in a way that they maybe had never listened to each other before, and that they were able to talk in an honest and open way without the sense that for example, the caregiver feeling like they needed to be a cheerleader who was always saying, no, this is going to work out. There was a clear sense that there was a shift and that honesty and an open approach to what the future might likely bring was more acceptable and comfortable after having gone through the mindfulness program. Many also mentioned being able to talk with their oncologist in a way they had not prior to the mindfulness intervention, that they were able to ask questions they may have avoided previously and get additional information about their prognosis and even open up conversations around advanced care planning. So it felt that this was an additional change made possible by these mindfulness practices. Finally, and I begun going in that direction already, the final theme was improved communication. And so we started talking about that. In addition to improved relationships, I think the enhanced communication practices that were provided during the mindful care, the model care program, helped not only strengthen the relationships, but really did help enhance and encourage conversations about difficult issues, including advanced care planning. In summary, the model care program, and specifically the mindfulness practices that were part of that program, not only helped patients and their caregivers better cope with the challenges of cancer, but also lowered their emotional reactivity to some of the difficulties and difficult emotions that you experience, including anxiety and fear, during their time with cancer. It strengthened their relationships with each other and improved their communication, both with themselves, with others in their family, and with their oncologist. So those were some of the results that we found through our analysis of the interviews and also the survey responses.
I'm curious about some of the implications of those results. What are some things that stand out for you about what this may mean for those who have cancer, for those caregivers? And what would you like to see happen with the model care program?
Sure. So I think that we discovered, at least for this small population, that the mindfulness practices were very beneficial in terms of improving quality of life for patients and caregivers during their experience of cancer. I think it also helped us better understand, perhaps, how to move forward with advanced care planning, particularly for this group of patients. It's been a real struggle in terms of trying to understand why would individuals who would be so well suited to begin thinking about their futures, ensuring that the values of the patient are identified and that future care and treatment will reflect those values. Why is this not happening? And I think better understanding the emotional triggers that can prevent the advanced care planning helps us to think more creatively about the kinds of interventions that might foster advanced care planning with this group of patients and their caregivers. And so in terms of moving forward, we would like to have a bigger trial. This was a very small feasibility study to see if these similar results would be replicated on a wider scale. But in terms of the overarching kind of future hope, it would be to really be able to develop and widely integrate programs that would include these mindfulness practices as a standard component of patient care to help foster not only important conversations about advanced care planning, but a host of other important conversations that patients, caregivers, and their oncologists need to have in order to have the best end-of-life care experience, ensuring that patients are able to share their concerns along with their values and their fears, and the important conversations with caregivers and with oncologists to address those concerns and fears and to help facilitate patients living out what's most important to them at this critical time in their life would be a vision of how this kind of a program could be used to really enhance care and quality of life.
Thank you for that. So for those listening to the podcast, I'll have a couple of links with more information about all of this. Our guest today, Ann Cottingham, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.